Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading Black Bourgeoisie by E. Franklin Frazier, starting on page 26. We're going to be looking at the reason he wrote this book and some of the roots of the Black bourgeoisie.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Greetings, Forecast. I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. The purpose of the present study. The primary purpose of this study is to make a sociological analysis of the behavior, the attitudes, and values of the Black bourgeoisie, a group which began to play an important role among American Negroes during the past 2 decades. Our analysis will deal with the two aspects of the life of the Black bourgeoisie. The first being the real or objectively existing economic condition and social status of the Black bourgeoisie in the United States, and the second being the standards of behavior and values of the isolated social world of this segment of the Negro population, which has come into existence as a consequence of racial discrimination and racial segregation. The first part of this study, which deals with the real status of the Black bourgeoisie, will be concerned first with the process by which the Black bourgeoisie has emerged in the United States as a result of a slow and difficult occupational differentiation of the Negro population. Against this background will be analyzed the present economic basis of this class, especially as regards the recent changes that have occurred in the economic position of the Negro in the American economy. The study of the economic position of the Black bourgeoisie will include a realistic appraisal of the significance of Negro business in the American economy, as well as in the economic life of the Negro. In this part of the study, attention will also be given to the education of the Negro, since education has been the principal social factor responsible for the emergence of the Black bourgeoisie. Special attention will be directed to the influence of the segregated schools and colleges on the aspirations and social outlook of the Black bourgeoisie. Our analysis will be directed next to the political outlook of this class and the power which the Black bourgeoisie exercises over Negroes, since the same economic and social forces in American life, which have been largely responsible for the existence of Negro education, have shaped the political orientation of the Black bourgeoisie. The concluding chapter of the first part will deal with what, from a sociological standpoint, has been one of the most important consequences of the emergence of the Black bourgeoisie, namely, the uprooting of this stratum of the Negro population from its racial traditions, or more specifically, from its folk background. As the result of the break with its cultural past, the Black bourgeoisie is without cultural roots in either the Negro world, with which it refuses to identify, or the white world, which refuses to permit the Black bourgeoisie to share its life. So they are cultural nomads. This chapter will provide a transition to the second part of the study, which will be devoted to the behavior of the Black bourgeoisie in the social world which has grown up out of its isolation in American life. Lacking a cultural tradition and rejecting identification with the Negro masses on the one hand and suffering from the contempt of the white world on the other, the Black bourgeoisie has developed a deep-seated inferiority complex. In order to compensate for this feeling of inferiority, the Black bourgeoisie has created, in its isolation, what might be described as a world of make-believe, in which it attempts to escape the disdain of whites and fulfill its wish for status in American life. One of the most striking indications of the unreality of the social world which the Black bourgeoisie created in its faith in the importance of Negro business, in other words, the business enterprises owned by Negroes and catering to Negro customers. Although these enterprises have little significance either from the standpoint of the American economy or the economic life of the Negro, a social myth has been created that they provide a solution to the Negro's economic problems. So Black-owned businesses, in his perspective, that provided goods and services to people is a myth. Faith in this social myth and others is perpetuated by Negro newspapers, which represent the largest and most successful business enterprises established by Negroes. Moreover, the Negro newspapers help to create and maintain the world of make-believe in which Negroes can realize their desires for recognition and status in a white world that regards them with contempt and amusement. Much of the news featured in the Negro newspapers is concerned with the activities of the members of Negro society, or it tends to make socialites out of most Negroes whose activities are considered newsworthy. Society is a phase of the world of make-believe which represents an acute form of the Negro's long preoccupation with social life as an escape from his subordinate status in America. So people use parties, social engagements, special clubs, marriage announcements, wedding announcements, and all of these things that comprise of their social life to escape their status in America. Since the world of make-believe cannot, insulate the black bourgeoisie completely from the world of reality, the members of this class exhibit considerable confusion and conflict in their personalities. So, no matter how hard they try, they cannot escape blackness. Their emotional and mental conflicts arise partly from their constant striving for status within the Negro world, as well as in the estimation of whites. Moreover, they have accepted unconditionally the values of the white bourgeoisie world, its morals and its canons of respectability, its standards of beauty and consumption. But remember, the white world and the black world are very different. In fact, they have tended to overemphasize their conformity to white ideals. Nevertheless, they are rejected by the white world, and this rejection has created considerable self hatred since it is attributed to their Negro characteristics. At the same time, because of their ambivalence towards Negroes, they are extremely sensitive to slights and discriminations which Negroes suffer. Since they do not truly identify themselves with Negroes, the hollowness of the Black bourgeoisie's pretended racial pride is revealed in the value which it places upon a white or light complexion. Because of their social isolation and lack of a cultural tradition, the members of the Black bourgeoisie in the United States seems to be in the process of becoming nobody. What what significance then does the fate of the Black bourgeoisie in the United States have for the bourgeoisie of other racial or cultural minorities that have come into existence as the result of the expansion of Western civilization and European capitalism? Part 1: The World of Reality. The Roots of the Black Bourgeoisie. Give me one moment. Now, I want you to remember Dr. John Henrik Clarke said,
Every single thing that touches your life, whether it is religious, social, or political, must be an instrument of your liberation, or you must throw it into the ash can of history.
all right, the roots of the Black bourgeoisie, where do they come from? If one could ferret out the roots of the Black bourgeoisie in the United States, it would have to study the varied and sporadic efforts of the Negroes who were free before the Civil War to acquire wealth. However, it was not until after emancipation that the spirit of modern business enterprise really took root among the Negro elite. This was due to their association with the Freedmen's Bank, which was established to encourage thrift among the newly emancipated slaves. While the initiation of the Negro elite in the field of business enterprise ended with the failure of the Freedmen's Bank, the spirit of business enterprise engendered by this experience was never lost. Whereas an increasing number of Negroes continued to set up small stores and shops and a few larger undertakings, primarily to serve the needs of the segregated Negro communities, it was mainly in the field of banking that the new spirit of business enterprise manifested itself. Negro leaders in all areas of community life, education, religion, and fraternal organizations began to organize their own banks in a number of cities in the South. Efforts of the free Negroes to acquire wealth. Before the Civil War, the ownership of land or real estate was the main avenue open to the free Negro who undertook to acquire wealth. During the latter years of the 18th century, following the American Revolution, free Negroes began to acquire land in New York and Pennsylvania. Some of the free Negroes who migrated from the South gradually acquired land in southern Ohio during the early decades of the 19th century. In those areas of the Upper South, which were not dominated by the plantation system, some free Negroes were even able to acquire land despite the general opposition to their presence. As the plantation system of agriculture became unprofitable in the Tidewater section of Maryland because of the exhaustion of the soil, the plantations were broken up into small farms, and some of the growing numbers of free Negroes were able to buy small farms in the poorer sections of this area. Matron side note, remember, they didn't want free Negroes near their slaves they didn't want free enterprising Negroes near their slaves. Because if a slave saw a freedman, they could see themselves as a freedman. The plantation system was also dying out in the Tidewater section of Virginia for the same reason as in Maryland, which meant that they had exhausted the soil. And the free Negro population was increasing. In 1830, the free Negroes owned about 32,000 acres of land valued at $184,184. And by 1860, both the acreage and the value of the farms owned by free Negroes had doubled, since nearly half, or 43%, of the farms owned by the 1,200 free Negro farm owners contained 25 acres or less. It may be assumed that these farms were used for subsistence rather than for commercial enterprises. So they had small family farms. In North Carolina, where the plantation system was never as extensive as in the states farther south, a small number of free Negroes acquired land. Slightly more than 10%, or 3,659 of the 30,463 free Negroes in the state were listed as owners of property in 1860. 1,211 of whom owned real estate having a total value of $480,986. It was only in Louisiana where, under French rule, a considerable class of free mulattoes, or gens de couleur, had become important, that free Negroes owned large plantations with slaves. The value of some of these plantations ranged from $40,000 to $200,000, and they had from 40 to 100 slaves. In the cities of the North, as well as of the South, the free Negroes were able to accumulate some wealth through the ownership of real estate. The free Negroes of Philadelphia owned nearly 100 houses before 1800, and by 1856, their real estate holdings were valued at $800,000 in that year's money, which was tens of millions of dollars in today's money. In 1853, it was reported at a convention of colored people in Rochester that Negroes owned over $1 million in real estate in New York City. By 1840, the free Negroes in Cincinnati, Ohio, had accumulated $228,000 in real estate. The real estate holdings of free Negroes in the District of Columbia amounted to $630,000, and in Baltimore, about $500,000 at the opening of the Civil War. Among the taxpayers in Charleston, South Carolina in 1860, there were listed 371 free persons of color, including 13 Indians, who paid taxes on real estate valued at about $1 million and 389 slaves. In New Orleans, where the free Negroes, or gens de couleur, were better off economically and socially than in other parts of the South, their holdings in real estate and slaves were estimated to be from 10 to $15 million in 1860s money. Except in Louisiana, the majority of nearly 4,000 Negroes in the United States who owned slaves lived in urban communities. Side note, there are a couple of things you have to remember about Black people that owned slaves. Sometimes these were people that owned their spouses and children because somebody could pass in the household or somebody was free in the household. And so these family members had to be listed as enslaved people. Husbands and wives would be enslaved to one another sometimes. And sometimes these people were really just slave owners. They were light skinned, could pass for white, mulatto based slave owners. So there were a lot of different factors that went into these Black people who owned slaves and lived in urban communities. In many cases, the Negro owners of slaves had bought a wife or a husband, a brother, a sister, or children who were slaves and who thus became legally slaves of the Negro who bought them. Although it is impossible to say what proportion of the Negro owners of slaves bought them for philanthropic motives, those free Negroes who owned plantations or maintained large estates in Charleston and New Orleans owned slaves for the same reason as white slaveholders. So you hear that? If they had plantations or large estates, they had slaves for the same reasons that white people did. Moreover, it appears that in the cities, the Negro owners of slaves were often motivated, as the white owners, to profit in buying and selling slaves. But slaves were a relatively small part of the personal property which the free Negroes were able to accumulate in cities. In the cities where the free Negroes were able to engage in a number of occupations, they managed to accumulate some capital and engage in business undertakings. In the southern cities, the free Negro artisans provided much of the skilled labor. Among the 700 employed free Negro males in Charleston, South Carolina in 1850, there were 122 carpenters, 87 tailors, 30 shoemakers, 14 wheelwrights, 18 bricklayers, 23 butchers, 10 bootmakers, 14 millwrights, and 11 painters. Free Negroes were found in a larger number of skilled occupations in New Orleans than in any other city in the country. In addition to the occupations enumerated for Charleston, South Carolina, the free Negroes, or gens de couleur, were listed in 1850 as bookbinders, cabinet makers, cigar makers, masons, co-opers, sail makers, architects, brokers, clerks, teachers, and capitalists. The forecast says it's a reason why they only really talk about Negro slave owners in South Carolina. Most of them were mulattoes. Exactly. Although the skilled Negro workers did not occupy in northern cities the same strategic position as in southern cities, a few of them were to be found in a large number of occupations. They were to be found in small numbers in most of the occupations listed for the free Negroes in Charleston, South Carolina, and in New Orleans, but they were not found in such occupations as architects, bookbinders, brickmakers, cabinet makers, masons, upholsterers, or occupations in which they would meet the keen competition of immigrant European labor. So they didn't even go into these markets because they would be competing with white people for jobs. A relatively large proportion of the free Negroes in the northern areas had to depend upon domestic and personal service for a living. So you hear that? The types of jobs that these free people in the north had, they were maids and personal service workers, janitors, butlers. Some of the free Negro artisans in cities worked independently and set up small businesses. In addition to the 21 Negroes who were listed in Boston in 1850 as traders, there were tailors, hairdressers, and barbers who worked independently. Even in New Orleans, they had what the whole mulatto and quadroon balls. Yeah, and the Blue Vein Society was big in New Orleans too. The free Negroes in New York City owned a newspaper, a dyeing establishment, a drugstore, small stores, and restaurants. There were among the most successful Negro businessmen in Philadelphia, a sail manufacturer, a broker, and a lumber merchant. In the cities of Virginia, the free Negroes worked independently as blacksmiths, millers, boatmen, restaurant operators, tavern keepers, and grocery men. You have to remember that they may have also had enslaved people that worked with and for them that they didn't know were enslaved, because there was this thing called urban slavery. And in urban slavery, you hired yourself out or got a job, but you paid your owner a fee, and then you got to keep the rest of the money, but you were still an enslaved person. So urban slavery was a thing as well. As we have seen in New Orleans, free Negroes were listed not only as tailors, cigar makers, and blacksmiths, occupations in which they worked independently, but as merchants, brokers, and capitalists. The business operations of the free Negro extended beyond these occupational groups. For example, the free Negroes in New Orleans, as in other southern cities, accumulated money as draymen or in the field of transportation, because this was a type of business in which white men did not enter. You hear that? So they had economic opportunity because there were some businesses and some jobs white folks wouldn't do. Then they amassed wealth in those occupations and businesses associated with cooking. In both northern and southern cities, they operated taverns for whites. And in New York and Philadelphia, a number of Negro caterers achieved financial success as well as renown in their professions. There were still other ways in which free Negroes were able to accumulate wealth. Because of their precarious economic position in the cities, the free Negroes organized mutual aid societies. These societies not only provided mutual aid, but encouraged saving and the accumulation of wealth. In a number of cities, there were individual Negroes who engaged in money lending using the wealth which they had accumulated as a barber or carpenter for capital. So they had their own independent financial system where the mutual aid societies would help them and where they had money lenders that worked other jobs, such as being a barber or a carpenter or a millwright or some other job or a mason, and those people would lend money within the community, usually with interest. And they did that, and they do that to this very day in some companies. There are still small groups of people that are doing those very same things where one person has a really good job and they're able to accumulate some savings and they use that to lend money out to other people. It has been estimated that the free Negroes accumulated $50 million in real and personal wealth before the Civil War. The savings and business undertakings on the part of the free Negroes reflected the spirit and values of their environment. Through thrift and saving, white American artisans hoped to accumulate wealth and get ahead. This spirit was encouraged among the free Negroes by their leaders, one of the most distinguished of them, of whom has been described as a Black Benjamin Franklin. In fact, these free Negroes were trained in the old style bourgeoisie spirit represented by Benjamin Franklin. It was not until after emancipation that the new bourgeoisie spirit would take hold among the leaders of the freedmen. So, as you can see, they had values very close to and closely related to the white people which they were trying to emulate. Many of them could pass for white, and they copied white men behaviors. Savings and thrift were encouraged, so they didn't have this conspicuous consumption mentality. But when you're coming from a place of want and lack, conspicuous consumption becomes your way of being. The Freedmen's Savings Bank. During the Civil War, a number of banks were established in order to enable Negro soldiers to save all or part of the allotments which the government made to them or their families. As the war drew to a close, an army paymaster and a congregational minister who had served as an army chaplain devised a plan for setting up a bank in order to encourage thrift on the part of the newly emancipated Blacks. As the result of their efforts, an act was passed by Congress and signed by Abraham Lincoln on March 3rd of 1865, providing for the establishment of the Freedmen's Savings Bank. According to the Congressional Act, the purpose of the bank was to receive deposits offered by or in behalf of persons heretofore held in slavery in the United States or their descendants. It was also stated in the act creating the bank that any interest uncalled for in the 2 years should be used for the education of Negro children. Although, according to the act, it appeared that the bank was to restrict its activities to the District of Columbia, branches were set up in various parts of the country. Within less than a year, 10 branches were set up, and at the end of 1866, 10 more branches were established. During the period of its expansion, a total of 34 branches were established, 32 of which were in the South. The rapid expansion was due to a campaign which was carried on among the ex-slaves. They were told that the bank had the backing of Lincoln and were given the impression, at least, that it was guaranteed by the Congress and government of the United States. Moreover, the fact that the bank was a benevolent institution established for the ex slaves was emphasized in order to secure the deposits of Negroes. So they tricked them. They told them that this money was basically FDIC insured before FDIC insurance was a thing. Greetings, KW Don 7. Thanks for tuning in. They told them that the bank was a benevolent institution established for the ex slaves, and that was emphasized in order to secure their deposits. Despite the enthusiastic support which Negroes gave to the bank, this support being reflected in the rapid accumulation of deposits, the bank began to run into difficulties. These difficulties were due partly to certain weaknesses in the organization of the bank. Those responsible for the bank were not legally bound by the charter of the bank, nor did they have any financial interest in the institution. Moreover, during the rapid expansion of the bank, some of the branches which were set up became a liability. As long as the headquarters of the bank was in New York, it was conducted by businessmen who regarded their responsibility as a public trust. But when the headquarters was moved to Washington, it was placed in the hands of incompetent missionaries and speculators. However, in accounting for the failure of the bank, one must take into account for the hostility of Southern whites and the fact that the failure of the bank was one incident among many others in the reckless expansion during the post-Civil War period, which ended in the Panic of 1873. When the Freedmen's Savings Bank was on the verge of failure, Frederick Douglass, who after escaping from slavery himself, became the leading abolitionist orator of the day and later the greatest leader of the Negroes, was made president of the bank. Douglass, who thought that the bank was sound, believed he could save this symbol of the Negro's achievement of equality in American life. In his autobiography, he wrote, about 4 months before this splendid institution was compelled to close its doors in the starved and deluded faces of its depositors, and while I was assured by its president and by its actuary of its sound condition, I was solicited by some of its trustees to allow them to use my name in the board as a candidate for its presidency. So I walked, so I waked up one morning to find myself seated in a comfortable armchair with gold spectacles on my nose and to hear myself addressed as president of the Freedmen's Bank. I could not help reflecting on the contrast between Frederick the slave boy running about at Colonel Lloyd's with only in tow a linen shirt to cover him, and Frederick, president of a bank, counting its assets by millions. I had heard of golden dreams, but such dreams had no comparison with this reality. And yet, this seeming reality was scarcely more substantial than a dream. My term of service on this golden height covered only the brief space of 3 months, and these 3 months were divided into two parts. During the first part, which I was quietly employed in an effort to find out the real condition of the bank and its numerous branches. This was no easy task. On paper and from the representations of its management, its assets amounted to $3 million, and its liabilities were about equal to its assets. So the bank was $3 million in debt. And they set up Frederick Douglass to take the blame for it. Exactly. And he didn't even see it. They stole all our money and savings, and they set up Frederick Douglass to take the blame for it. And exactly. And he was, in writing in his autobiography, he made it sound in that excerpt so poetic, as though it was some type of Negro dream come true, that Frederick the slave running around the plantation was so different from Frederick the president of a bank. Frederick undertook to save the bank by instituting economies and by closing the branches that were a liability. He was so confident of the soundness of the bank that he lent $10,000 of his own money. Despite the efforts of Douglass, the bank was finally forced to close in 1874. During the 6 years which were required to liquidate the assets of the bank, 40% of the deposits were paid to the principal depositors, while the majority of small depositors failed to receive dividends either because they could not be located or they had given up hope of recovering their deposits. Although Negro leaders once made the dubious claim that the failure of the Freedmen's Bank destroyed the faith of Negroes in banks and discouraged thrift among them, the bank succeeded nevertheless in giving the Negroes training in business and in implanting in them bourgeoisie ideas. The literature distributed by the bank was designed to teach them how their savings would increase through interest and how thrift would bring them the things they desired. Booklets containing pictures and poems which provided home advice on thrift as the means to riches were widely distributed among the Negroes. Gradually, Negro clerks and officials were employed in the various branches of the bank, and Negroes were made advisors and directors of the institution. Douglass's recollection of the pride and amazement which he felt when seeing Negro clerks in the main branch of the bank in Washington gives some indication of what the bank symbolized in the aspirations of the Negro to conform to American ideals. But we think that Frederick Douglass was a militant integrationist because he wanted to be a part of white society, inevitably marrying a white woman before he left this world. In passing it on the street, I often peeped into the spacious windows and looked down the row of gentlemanly and elegantly dressed colored clerks with their pins behind their ears and buttonhole bouquets in their front coats, and felt my very eyes enriched. It was a sight I had never expected to see. I was amazed with the facility with which they counted the money. They threw off thousands with dexterity, if not the accuracy of old and experienced clerks. The whole thing was beautiful. I had read of this bank when I lived in Rochester and had indeed been solicited to become one of its trustees and had reluctantly consented to do so. But when I came to Washington and saw its magnificent brown stone front, its towering height, and its perfect appointments, and the fine display it made in the transaction of its business, I felt like the Queen of Sheba when she saw the riches of Solomon. The half had not been told me. So he had been sold on the dream. independent ventures in the field of banking. The spirit of business enterprise, which had been implanted among Negroes by the Freedmen Savings Bank, began to blossom forth within 15 years after the failure of that institution. Beginning in 1888, Negroes organized at least 134 banks between that year and 1934. All over the South, during the years prior to 1910, banks organized by Negroes sprang up like mushrooms, but died almost as rapidly as they were organized. In 1888, Negroes organized two banks, the Savings Bank of the Grand Fountain of United Order of True Reformers in Richmond, Virginia, and the Capital Savings Bank in Washington, D.C. During the following year, the Mutual Trust Company was organized in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and in 1890, the Alabama Penny Savings and Loan Company was established in Birmingham, Alabama. So we were banking. We were banking. This myth about us being unbanked and not having accounts and not trusting banks, we just don't have the wherewithal anymore. Usually, we don't have the money and the resources to meet the rules and requirements of a low cost banking account. And they've taken so much wealth from us in the preceding decades that we don't have the ability to save because nobody does. Within the 7 years from 1899 to 1905, at least 28 banks were opened in various southern cities by Negroes. But at the end of 1905, all of the banks organized by Negroes, of all the banks organized by Negroes, only 7 were still in existence. The widespread and numerous ventures of Negroes in the field of banking were due to a number of causes, both economic and social. The majority of the early attempts to set up banks were designed to provide depositors for the funds which were accumulated by the fraternal organizations. These fraternal organizations, together with the sickness and burial societies, began to flourish after the emancipation of the Negro. This was owing to the fact that following emancipation, the Negro was dependent upon his own resources and initiative, and therefore, cooperation for mutual aid in meeting the crises of life became necessary. At the same time, ex slaves had been taught the ideals of thrift and savings by the Yankee missionaries who had gone into the South to establish schools for the freedmen. The spirit of business enterprise, which had been at the basis of the propaganda carried on by the promoters of the Freedmen Bank, became an article of faith, as we shall see later, after the Negro lost his political rights and was gradually eliminated from skilled occupations. So, as you can see, they had an ongoing campaign of propaganda in an attempt to convince Black people to bank and to become financially sound. The circumstances under which the first Negro Bank, the True Reformer Bank as it was known, was organized in 1888 to throw light on the problems with which the pioneer Negro businessmen undertook to solve through business enterprise. The United Order of True Reformers was founded in 1876 by a former slave who had become a preacher in order to provide sick and death benefits for its members. As a result of a lynching, followed by rumors that the whites were planning to destroy one of the lodges of the order, which had entrusted its funds with a white storekeeper, it was decided that the order should establish a bank as a depository for its funds. The funds of the bank were to be used to finance stores, a hotel, and other enterprises of the order. So they had the right idea to support a home for the aged Negroes and to finance a rural enterprise, including the raising and marketing of agricultural products and a Negro community. From the account of this rural enterprise, as given by an officer of the order, one may see how the faith in business enterprise was mingled with the Negro's religious faith. The farm consisted of 634 and one quarter acres of land. In September 1889, 130 lots were cut off and ordered for sale. Notwithstanding the gloom of darkness that hung densely over the project, those of the faith rallied to the flag, and many lots were sold. Some paid cash in full, and others paid in part. All of this was done by faith. God sent men of means with an electric car line terminating at the boundary of the farm, which links Richmond and Westham together, and doubly increased the value of the land. All of these things are evidence of God's goodness and his acquiescence in the good work. This Negro settlement is destined to be the finest place of resort and pleasure of the Southland. It is called Brownville in honor of the founder of the order. In 1902, every lot had been sold. The bank conducted by this order failed in 1910, as many other banks did during this period and subsequently. The stores, which were financed by the order, were operated at a heavy loss, probably because they were giving out credit to people that didn't have the ability to have credit, and because they had to acquire their goods and services from white stores in an attempt to compete, and they didn't have the right, they couldn't adjust their price point in such a way that they would not have to operate at a heavy loss. Although the failure of the bank was due partly to the negligence and dishonesty of the management, its failure was foredoomed by the unproductive use of its credit. Didn't I tell you? Extending credit to people that don't have money. The failure of this bank, as well as the failure of other ventures by Negroes in banking, was due partly to their ignorance of banking principles, because they'll never teach you the real game, but they'll let you go out there and hit your head and be a crash test dummy all you want. At the same time, these failures indicate the difficulties faced by banks conducted by Negroes for the purpose of supporting racial business enterprises. Negro banks were organized primarily to supply Negro businessmen with credit and capital. But when one considers the nature of the Negro business enterprises for which Negro banks would supply credit and capital, the difficulty of conducting banks primarily for Negro enterprises becomes clear. Except for the insurance companies, the only outlets for the credit resources of Negro banks were in real estate, small and inconsequential retail stores, and the amusement and personal service enterprises conducted by Negroes. So you see that real estate, small and inconsequential retail stores, amusements, and personal services. Those are the fields we're relegated to today. Entertainment is amusement. These enterprises do not offer an opportunity for the type of commercial transactions which are necessary for banking activities. Many a Negro bank which has failed possessed only frozen and depreciated real estate holdings among its important assets. Negro leaders, not only those engaged in business, have asserted that the organization of Negro banks was necessary because of the refusal of white banks to grant credit and capital to Negroes. Although white banks, because of racial prejudice, have at times refused credit to Negro businessmen, allegedly, the main reason for their refusal has been their understanding of the economic factors responsible for the failure of the Negro banks. So he's saying that these white banks were not necessarily racist in denying Black people credit, but that they understood how business worked, and they didn't want to finance Black people that didn't know how business worked. But that's why the most powerful tool you can have is a well written business plan. If you do nothing else, invest in yourself in learning how to do a business plan appropriately. We may conclude our discussion on the origins of the Black bourgeoisie with these remarks on Negro banks. Since the banks have been the main symbols of the bourgeoisie spirit among Negroes, in the next chapter, we shall turn our attention to an analysis of the present economic basis of this class in the Negro community. So, as you can see, there have been a lot of challenges with the Black bourgeoisie and banking and Black people in general understanding banking. We still, to this day, don't have the financial literacy that's necessary for us to be productive citizens and for us to be as efficient and as effective as we would like to be. We don't have the education that we need in order to even get our messages across sometimes. Because to do propaganda well, it has to be audio, visual, and tactile. They have to be able to touch it. So we need to be able to invest in something that has a jingle, that has some type of meaning to it, that has some type of pictures and images to it, that puts people in a mind frame and makes a memory for them so that they can buy into the propaganda that we want them to buy into. But that is all for today. I promise you guys, I read for an hour and then I let you guys go free. I give y'all free. Um, and I'll be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, reading the economic basis of middle class status. But today we focused on banking and the history, some of the history that the Black bourgeoisie tap into when they talk about their banking and some of the things that happened, namely the Freedmen's banking situation that has so many people up in arms. They often tell us that we are unbanked. We are not unbanked. We are not commercially banked. We don't necessarily tap into their banking systems, but we had our own banking systems. We had money that was circulating within our communities, but their desire to want to track our money they want to track our money, and they want to track the way that we're spending money, and we do things and have done things consistently in a way that they weren't able to always track it. And that's what the problem is to this very day. They want to be able to track us, they want to be able to count the money, they want to know what we're doing with our money. And the Black bourgeoisie had ways around that at a time. and we still have ways around that to this day. You probably know a loan shark. All right, guys, I want to thank KW Don 7 and the Forecast for being here. I know that Anthony McPhail is listening. I know that Sister Ron the Elders are listening. I know that Bawana Haguziki is listening. I know that Brother Bakari is listening. I know that Jaijin is listening. I know that Denial is listening. I know that the ladies from the Daycare Ladies Network are listening. I know that the ladies from Jesse's Kids are listening. I know that the staff at the Anthony Adrian Academy are listening. So it's Tinkerbell 87 and you. Yes, you. I appreciate you all for listening. I thank you and I appreciate and value everything you give me. I will talk to you tomorrow. Peace, guys.